Hi, and welcome back. Now, I'd like to have a look at Swimlane processes for people in looking at business processes. This is probably somewhat very familiar to you, and you think, well, what else is there? Well, there are a lot of other things, but for the moment, we'll just look at the Swimlane processes. So these were developed by Gary Rumler and Alan Braish around about 1990 when they were looking at how organizations did work. And at that time, work in organizations was largely thought of as things that happened within divisions. So you get the accounting division, you get the HR division, and you get some other division, and the work was handed between these divisions. In fact, Rumler and Braish found that wasn't what happened at all. That the work, in fact, happened across the divisions. It happened in the white space between these divisions, which is where you get the matrix management kind of thing. So they found it useful. They needed some way to express the business processes as opposed to, say, manufacturing processes. And although they could have used flowcharts didn't express the kind of things they wanted to express. But having developed these swimlane diagrams, they've now been taken up by the business community, and it's now a standard method of documenting business processes in the business process management community. So, a swimlane diagram is in many ways simply a structured flow chart. Now, business processes, along with decisions and branches, can be expressed in a flow chart. You can do that. Anybody who's familiar with building flow charts can document, you could say you can document pretty much anything. Well, you can, but it may not be particularly useful. What we want to do is take that flow chart and separate out the responsibilities so you can see who is responsible for what. We also would like to step that flow chart out into some sort of a logical either time-based sequence or business flow sequence, some way to have a look at the flow of it. So we put responsibility as rows and time phases, or the business process stages and phases, as the columns. Or if you want to do it the other way around, you can do it the other way around. You can have the responsibilities as columns and the steps or the stages as rows. Usually, though, it's responsibilities as rows, simply because computer screens tend to be wider than they are deep, and it tends to go along the responsibilities. We're much more interested in that. So here's an example of a swimlane diagram, a very simple example. It's a proposal for a new project, and you can see it there. This one has been prepared with responsibilities as rows, and the sequence or stages in the process as columns. It gets laid out fairly neatly. It looks good, it's easy to understand, and is very familiar in business process terminology, and it seems to be fairly well accepted in the business community. The next one is pretty much the same thing, but with rows and columns reversed. So we have the responsibilities in columns and the sequence of stages vertically in rows. Now, the advantages of swim lanes, well, they are very easy to understand. I was talking to a company that used them as their standard means of documenting and explaining a new business process. But everybody just cottoned onto it pretty easy, and everybody understood what it was about. Some people became quite elaborate in their documentation of this swim lane diagram, where they had not only the activity that went on, but they put in, what information went in here and what came out there. Quite an elaborate diagram, but they're very easy to understand. They are very flexible, able to be very high level, or you can decompose them just into sub-diagrams. So any one particular activity as a responsibility could be decomposed into another complete Swimlane diagram that had a much finer granularity. So it's very, very flexible that way. There is wide acceptance that this is a pretty good way to document business processes, so that's always a good advantage. It means you don't have to explain the whole thing all over again every time you use it. It does separate responsibility, but does tend to hide the activities within those responsibilities. So that you could see that as an advantage or a disadvantage. The comment that people make about the Swimlane diagrams is that they do expose dependencies, bottlenecks, redundancies, and other problems in the business process itself. They are very good for basically debugging a business process. The disadvantages of them? Now, so far as I can see, it's difficult to reason about process failure and process improvement. I mean, if the whole thing fails, if it fails, what do you start looking at? What's in the Swimlane diagram that you can use to diagnose the problem? And there's not much, so it's not very good for that of itself. There isn't any particular way to detect problems that affect quality. The Swimlane diagrams are more concerned about the fact that something is finished or the fact that something is done, not the manner in which it's done or the quality of the output that's there. So in summary then, the Swimlane diagrams were developed by Rumler and Braish in about 1990. They become widely accepted as a standard way to document business processes. They are very good for exposing redundancies and bottlenecks. They're not so good for exposing or diagnosing problems in the quality of any output that's been put there. But they were never intended for that.